Please help me welcome Geralyn Sparough.
Hello. When I was growing up, I had my very own knight in shining armor. Now, his armor was a little dusty and looked more like a business suit, and his steed was a sensible family car. But his heart was a knight's heart, full of love and courage and adventure. And he not only protected me, his princess, but he taught me how to dream impossible dreams and to make them come true. And he taught me how to eat strange foods just for the experience. And he showed me how to make friends in unlikely places. And he encouraged me to reach for the stars. Probably most importantly, my knight modeled for me how to die gracefully. My knight was my dad. In July 2014, my dad had had enough. The treatments for lung disease and congestive heart failure had worn him out. They didn't seem to make him any better and oftentimes made him much worse. So he and my mother together decided that it was time for him to enter hospice. At the intake meeting, the hospice folks asked him what he wanted to have happen in his care. And he told them that he wanted to have a wake while he was still alive and he could hear what everyone had to say about him. And he wanted to sing. Now, it wasn't any real surprise that Dad wanted to sing. Growing up, we'd always had a lot of music in our household and singing a lot. In fact, I have this one very clear memory of driving in the car with him one time. I was probably 6 years old. And we were driving down the main street of our little town. It was evening, it was dark. The lights on the street were all glittering like the stars. And we were on a quest for Vicks VapoRub. Because one of my younger siblings, at that time I only had 3, had a cough or a cold or the croup. And we'd been sent out to get the supplies. And I was leaning over my dad's back with my arm around his shoulder and my head up against his. Don't worry, it was safe. There weren't seatbelts in the car anyway. And we were singing at the top of our lungs to the radio. It was Petula Clark in downtown. It was a magical moment. My dad was an incredible person who never met anyone that he didn't want to get to meet more. His life motto was, friends are strangers, or strangers are friends I haven't met yet. And he was a good friend to the lonely. Another memory I have about this same age was he started bringing home for dinner a Korean merchant marine that I'm not exactly sure how he met. But we lived on the Washington State coast at the time in a port town, so Mr. Shin would come to town every couple of months, or he would, at least his boat would come to town. And Dad would bring him home for dinner, and every once in a while we would go to his ship to visit him. And there was one time in particular where Mr. Shin brought this beautiful basket of kumquats. And I had never seen a kumquat before, and probably, I don't know if any of you know that kumquats are grown in Korea. He had brought this basket all the way from Korea for us as a special gift. And I remember sitting at the table and picking up this little golden oblong and thinking it looked like a sun. And my dad said, try it. And I thought, you can't peel it because, kumquats look like little oranges, but they're a strange shape. And he said, no, put it in your mouth and try it. Just try it. And I remember putting that little golden sun in my mouth and biting down. It was the most incredible experience of bitter and sweet at the same time. It's the first time I think I can remember eating something just for the experience and not being worried about what it was going to taste like, unlike the lima beans that I took like pills and downed. These days, I'm known for eating through the menu. My husband teases me that it doesn't seem to matter whether or not I like what I'm eating. It's the experience that counts, because I can check that one off of, no, don't have to try that one again. But if there's a food I haven't tried yet, and it's on the menu and under $10, I will try it. Now, the hospice people provided a weekly music therapist to work with Dad, to help with the singing, and also to help us plan with this wake that we were going to have. And his name was also Michael. My dad's name is Michael. Was Michael, is Michael. My dad is Michael. And his music therapist's name was Michael. And he was a young man. He was just delightful. And within the first 10 minutes of the first meeting, my dad had firmly fallen in love with him. And by the end of the meeting, maybe even halfway through, Michael, the younger, had fallen in love with my father. It was the kind of love affair my mom could approve of. And they worked very hard to decide what songs and music we were going to have at Dad's wake. And Dad had a name for it. He called it Michael's Wide Awake. And he was wide awake for that experience. 80 people came. It was glorious. My father got everything he had hoped for in being able to tell people how much he loved them and them telling him how much they loved him. A highlight of the event was when my dad and my brother sang the song The Impossible Dream together. It began with just the two of them as a duet. And before long, the whole room had joined in because we had these great songbooks. To dream the impossible dream, to fight the unbeatable foe. Now, my dad was a lot like Don Quixote. He was a bit of a dreamer. He was known to champion underdogs, and he had more than once taken on giants in order to protect others. He was also a bit like Don Quixote in his wanderlust. He loved to drive, and in fact had taken a job that had him on the road a lot. I think I got a bit of that gene. I really enjoy driving trips as well, and I've been either a passenger or driven myself across country numerous times, here and abroad. And in fact, next week, I'll be driving to Florida for work and back in 7 days. It's the kind of trip Dad would have really liked. One thing that you should know about my dad besides that is that he always showed his love for us, but he wasn't always there. Like I said, he had this job that had him on the road a lot. Sometimes he would be gone from Sunday evening until Friday evening. And by this time, there were 6 kids in the family, so it was a little hard to get any time with him. That changed when my parents went on a couples retreat when I was 14, and they came back singing The Impossible Dream. And my dad, who'd been this traveling salesman, home on the weekend kind of dad, suddenly had a more than passing interest in what was happening in my life. Now, I can tell you that was really quite flattering as a 14-year-old girl in those days. I don't know if a 14-year-old girl would think the same now if her father suddenly showed an interest in what was happening in her life. But for me, it was an incredible experience to know that I mattered to my father, that I was someone that he wanted to know something more about. I've told a lot of people over the years that I had 2 dads growing up, and sometimes they look at me and they say, but your mom and your dad were always together, weren't they? And I said, yeah, but I had a dad before the retreat, and I had the dad after the retreat. And the dad that I knew after the retreat was a man with a huge heart, Everything he saw, he savored. Everyone he met, he loved. He had incredible hugs. He was famous for his hugs, and there's a few people here tonight who knew him, and he really only ever did hug. He believed that hugs were much more sanitary than handshakes. And so he would meet a new person, and they would put their hand out, and he'd go like this, and he'd say, "You know, handshakes spread germs." And somehow my dad could pull that off. It was quite the thing. Well, the summer after my parents went on this retreat, we played the soundtrack to The Man of La Mancha almost constantly in our household. And like I said, there were 6 kids, so we fought over the 3 main roles. You know, there's Don Quixote, the hero, and Sancho Panza, the quirky but funny sidekick, and Dulcinea, the love interest. Now, the girls didn't see any of those roles as gender specific. And we fought just as hard to be Don Quixote as Sancho Panza, as Dulcinea. But, you know, I was thinking about this earlier, and I really don't remember any of my brothers wanting to be Dulcinea. But I could have missed it. When the song, The Impossible Dream, came on the album, and it was the days of turning them over. You know, he was mentioning 8 tracks before. This was long before 8 tracks. It was my dad's hi-fi he had built himself. And The Impossible Dream, I think, was the first song on the second side, and we would fight over who's going to turn the album over, and we would all sing The Impossible Dream. It didn't matter who was Don Quixote, even though that was his song. And if Mom and Dad were nearby, they would join in and sing with us. It was an amazing experience. And it only lasted really that summer, because before long I was 15. And most 15-year-old girls don't play with their brothers and sisters anymore. It was a bit of a loss when I think about it now. My father had always shown his love for my mother, his Dulcinea, in very concrete ways, but now he was suddenly talking about it. And we half-dozen Sancho Panzas, to he really was our Don Quixote, well, sometimes we're extremely embarrassed. But it was really delightful. And there it is something when your friends tell you, it's so cute how your parents hold hands all the time. And I'd go, oh. That's my mother. And I'm going to go off script right now and tell you it's really good I can't see any of you, because I probably would have sobbed by now. So anyway, Dad was suddenly willing to share his love for my mother with anyone that he wanted to. And my mom and my dad had an incredible marriage of equals that went through highs and lows and joys and some tremendous sorrows for 58 years. And their relationship gave me something to strive for in my life. And I'm happy to be able to say that I've been married for 32 years. They've been amusing, sometimes exasperating, but always love-filled to that man over there. He's my own knight in shining armor. Well, the weekly music therapy sessions that my dad was having attracted friends and family. Sometimes there were 8 or 9 people who would be there singing and telling stories and reminiscing and making new memories. And I, at that point, was working in a way that I was able to go to almost every week's session. And it was really an incredible experience to be able to ask my dad what had happened at certain times in his life. And the music therapist was recording them. So we even have now all these recordings of my dad, and also to have this sense of my father's voice as it was changing, because the lung disease hardened his lungs, and he had difficulty breathing, and he only spoke in a whisper, and he'd always had this really beautiful, rich baritone voice. At Halloween time, something I should tell you is because of all those extra people there, we ended up having a second wake. Because unlike most people who go into hospice care, well, everybody, my dad would say nobody gets out alive, but it can be a very sorrowful time, and I don't want to make light of that by any means. But for us, it was a 16-month journey. My dad was in hospice care for 16 months. I used to tell people that hospice saved him. If he'd stuck with his treatments, he would have been dead long before those 16 months. And it was an opportunity to have this second wake was about 10 months into his journey with hospice. And Dad decided to call this one Michael's Not Too Wide Awake. TOO, although it was the second wake. So Halloween time came, and Dad had been in hospice care for about 15 months at this point in time. And I stopped by one night after my choir practice because we had, I would often stop by, but I stopped by this night in particular because we had just been learning a new song, and I wanted him to hear it. I'd recorded it at the practice, and it was this really beautiful song that we were going to sing just before Christmas. And it was about yearning and ancient grief and waiting for the joy that has been promised. But at this point now, being in that place of waiting and sorrow. And when I played it, we both kind of sat there, and I had tears running down my face, and I looked at him, and he had tears running down his face, and then he pulled out a tissue and handed it to me, said, "Here, you'll need this." And I told him that I had been thinking about trying out for a solo with the choir. And it had taken me years to get up enough courage to join the choir in the first place. And I wasn't sure if I had a good enough voice. And he told me, "Go for it, reach for the stars. You'll never know until you try." Within a couple of weeks, Dad had stopped eating. He was only sucking on popsicles, and he spoke sparingly. 2 or 3 days before he died, several of us kids were around his bed, and we were singing, "This is my quest to follow that star, no matter how hopeless, no matter how far." Dad hummed along while we pretty much sobbed our way through the lyrics to The Impossible Dream. I was sure that we must have sounded terrible, but my husband, who sat by while we sang, said that we sounded angelic. Our Don Quixote my beloved father, my knight in shining armor, was going to his rest. He died the week before Thanksgiving. It wasn't too long before there was an opportunity for me to audition for a solo with the choir. So I did. I didn't get it. Not the first time. But I remembered that my dad had said, "Go for it, reach for the stars. You'll never know until you try." So the next audition that came up, the next solo, I auditioned and I got it. It was 2 whole lines. My dad would have been so proud. One last thing. I know some people have a lot of music on their smartphones. I have one album on my phone, The Man of La Mancha. And the only song I really play off of it, The Impossible Dream. Thanks, Dad.
Please give it up again for Geralyn Sparough.